Chapter 37. Yes, it would, Garrett admitted freely, but I believe in the long run it would be worth it, especially since, if I were the royal family, I would not just invest in bringing people to my side, but would also invest in my opposition. Caught off guard, the Duke looked confused and glanced at Princess Eloise, who was just as lost as he was. Why would you invest in your opposition? Not true opposition, Garrett explained, but instead manufactured opposition. I would find someone I could trust, and I would work to make them the leader of the party that opposed the royal family. Pausing for half a beat, Garrett suddenly smiled. Much like the late king, rest his soul, did with your excellency. Slapping his desk with his palm, Duke Arkoff let out a great shout of laughter. His eyes gleamed as he pointed a finger at Garrett. I like you, he said. That mind of yours is sharp, maybe too sharp. And you've got guts too. No one has ever had the guts to say that out loud, even if they sometimes thought it. But tell me, how did a kid like you figure it out when next to nobody else has? I've had the benefit of a unique position, Garrett said. My family has been privileged to be privy to many secrets in this kingdom, and I had the opportunity to walk alongside the late prince for many years. Most importantly, however, was the fact that you accepted my father's allegiance rather than executing him outright. That speaks to an arrangement between the two of you. And considering my father's loyalty to the crown, the only way that would possibly happen is if you and he were already on the same side. Shaking his head, Duke Arkoff flashed his shark-like smile and turned to speak to Princess Eloise. I've always said the men of the Klein family are too dangerous to let loose. Understand this, Eloise. You keep them close or you get rid of them altogether. Those are the only two options. Garrett could hear the naked threat in the Duke's voice and knew he wasn't joking one bit. The princess could sense the seriousness of her uncle's words as well. Shooting a glance at Garrett, she nodded. Considering the connection they shared through the dream flowers, Garrett knew what her decision was, and it suited him just fine. He was playing a dangerous game, under the nose of a man powerful enough to snuff him out with a finger. But if it paid out, the reward would be astronomical. Duke Arkoff chuckled again, clearly delighted with how sharp Garrett was. Standing, he walked to the window, gazing out over the garden that lay outside. There are many days when I wish for nothing more than to see my brother and his family return to the palace. He was a much better ruler than I could ever be, and I'm confident that Eloise will follow in his footsteps. While I'm still alive, I intend to ensure that she holds that position. He turned around, his eyes flickering to Rin, before settling on Garrett. Tell me, do I have your assurance that you will do the same? May I ask you a question before I answer, sir? Garrett said, without hesitating. A flash of displeasure rolled across the Duke's face, but he nodded. Is there anyone in the city who can match your power directly? Garrett asked. Though the Duke's expression had grown calm, Garrett felt as if it was the calm before a tremendous tempest. Why do you ask? Because that will determine whether I support the princess in the open or from the shadows, Garrett replied, his expression without guile. Princess Eloise will sit on the throne, that is guaranteed. But if there are others who are as strong as you, then it would be best for me to support her silently, without exposing myself to the public. After all, my only hope of beating someone with your power is catching them off guard. The feeling of pressure that had been building in the room eased as the Duke nodded. There's wisdom in that, he said. And to answer your question, no, I am the only person with this level of power in the city. But that doesn't mean your idea about supporting the princess in the darkness is a bad one. From what I understand, your small merchant group isn't quite so small and has a surprising wealth of connections with the local underworld. Additionally, I've been watching Commander Phoenix rise with interest, as well as the surprising way that enemies of the Klein family transform into allies. Listening as the Duke laid out his connections one by one, Garrett's face began to pale. Pleased with the effect of his words, the Duke walked back over and took his seat behind the desk once more. Such connections are no doubt a significant source of strength, and they could be even stronger if leveraged in service to the crown. Unless your father dies, which considering how hale and hearty he is, probably won't be for a number of decades, the princess won't need another steward. Which means that you'll have plenty of time to build those connections. Until such a time as the position of steward is vacated, I think it best if you continue to support the princess silently. Ostensibly, we have invited you here to the palace for a private meeting so that I could reward you and dismiss you. And to that end, I've prepared this. Picking up a piece of paper, the Duke stood and leaned over the desk, handing it to Garrett. It contained a simple seal along with gold lettering, and when he saw it, Garrett's eyes went wide in genuine surprise. This is a royal seal. Indeed, and it's for you to put on that soap of yours. What was it called? Rin's Royal Soap, now used in the palace. Behind Garrett, Rin, who had been listening to the whole conversation as tense as a rod, let out a surprised yelp, causing the Duke to grin at her. If I'm not mistaken, you're the Rin on the royal soap, right? Stammering out a yes, Rin quickly bowed, but the Duke waved for her to stand up. Like I said, no need for that. The truth is, we've been using your soap for a while. It's much better than most of the other soaps out there, even the royal stuff. The fragrance is much more subtle, which is nice. And I like the way you've added those little granules to help it scrub better. As a thank you for your service to Princess Eloise, you'll be permitted to use the royal seal on the boxes you sell your soap in. Additionally, all sales of the soap will be exempt from tax. Thank you, Your Highness, Garrett said, bowing, Rin quickly imitating him. It's the least we could do, considering the support you've shown our family. We'll be counting on you to continue that support into the future. Straightening, Garrett nodded. You have my word. Good. Now, unfortunately, I have much still to do, including a meeting coming up with your father, Garrett. Jumping to her feet, Eloise butted in. In that case, I'm going to take Garrett around the palace. For a moment, Garrett thought that the Duke might say no, but after thinking it over with a furrowed brow, he nodded. Fine. But remember, you can't be late for court this afternoon. I won't, the princess declared confidently. Come on, Garrett. Let's go. As she hurried to the door, Rin stepped behind Garrett, and after saying goodbye to the Duke, they left the office and found Princess Eloise chatting with Victor Klein in the hallway outside. The steward was wearing his public mask, and nothing but kindness could be detected in his gaze toward Princess Eloise. If he didn't know better, Garrett would have been just as convinced as everyone else that his father was nothing but the royal family's most loyal supporter. Ah, Garrett, Victor said, smiling fondly at his son. I was hoping to catch you here. Princess, Miss Rin, would you mind if I had a word? Of course, the princess said, as she and Rin walked towards the other end of the hall, leaving Garrett facing Victor. Seeing Garrett's eyes glance back at the office behind them, Victor smiled and crouched down until he was the same height as his son. At the same time, Garrett felt a cold pressure surround him, as if a chilly fog had rolled over him. Immediately, he was on guard, though he didn't show it on his face. According to his understanding, his father wasn't awakened, and even still, he found no soul spark in his father's body. Yet somehow, Victor Klein was manipulating the same sort of energy that permeated the dream. A prickling feeling caused the hair on the back of Garrett's neck to stand up, as his father spoke softly. Not even the Duke's absurd strength can spy on us, so feel free to talk freely. My power is subtle and impossible for the Duke to detect. After all, how do you think I've managed to walk through these halls unhindered so far? If Garrett hadn't been watching closely, he would have missed the faint crimson flash in his father's eyes. The madness was hidden a moment later, as Victor smiled. I'm glad to see you getting close to the princess. Just remember what our true objective is. I have, Garrett said, his voice as calm as he could make it. Victor must have picked up on the faint tremble Garrett had, because he straightened up and patted Garrett's shoulder. You're doing well, son. Keep doing well, and everything will go smoothly. What of the Duke? He is a lot stronger than I thought he would be. You don't have to worry about him, Victor said, his lips pulling back to reveal his teeth as he smiled widely. I'll deal with the Duke. With that, the clammy feeling vanished from the hall, and Victor gave Garrett a nod before entering the Duke's office. Taking a deep breath, Garrett looked over his shoulder at the office, where Victor had disappeared, and did his best to stabilize his jumping heart. There was a disturbing familiarity in the power that Victor had just shown, one that set Garrett's teeth on edge. And he suddenly began to wonder if there were forces at play in this game that he wasn't aware of. Hearing the princess call his name, he suppressed the thought in his heart, and began to make his way down the hall to join the two ladies. For the next hour, the princess took Garrett all over the palace, making a show of introducing him to the history of the building and the royals who had inhabited it. Garrett already knew most of this information, but he played along as the princess's true objective was to ensure that all of the servants and guards knew who Garrett was, and that he was currently favored. That way, in the future, if he happened to be in the palace, there wouldn't be any trouble. The longer the tour lasted, however, the grimmer Garrett's heart felt. He had first noticed the problem when a group of maids passed by them pushing a cart filled with laundry. Garrett, who was highly attuned to the presence of supernatural entities thanks to his familiarity with the dream flowers, saw a faint presence wrapped around one of the maids. He only noticed it because it actively recoiled when passing by the flowers blooming from the princess and Wren. At the same time, those flowers turned, their petals shaking, as if about to attack. Only Garrett's quick action kept them from killing off the nightmare that was currently latched onto the maid. Once he was alerted to it, however, he began to see similar nightmares attached to individuals all over the palace. While only a few of the maids and footmen had nightmares lurking alongside them, over a dozen guards had clearly been infected. As they got to the end of the tour, Garrett, who had been trying to puzzle out what was going on, turned to the princess. "Excuse me, Your Highness. One of the things that I often heard about while I was following your late brother was the Room of Mysteries. I remember peeking in once or twice, but at the time, because of my unawakened state, to my young eyes, it looked like a bunch of old, dusty relics. I would love to go and see it once again." Hesitating for a moment, the princess felt her heart shift slightly as she looked at Garrett. But with a mischievous smile, she agreed. "Sure, let's go," she said. "Just make sure you don't tell the Duke. He doesn't like it when people are in there." "You have my word, Princess." "You know soon you're going to have to start calling me Queen," Princess Eloise said archly. "I'm looking forward to it," Garrett replied. As the princess led the way, they headed towards the basement. This was actually the room that Garrett had been intending to send Isabel into. However, when she had gotten there, she had found it sealed. Not wanting to set off any alarms, Garrett had ordered her not to force her way in. After navigating a number of staircases, they finally arrived at the large door where the royal family's mysterious artifacts were kept. There was a guard at the gate, a grizzled old man who exuded shaper stage power. His eyes narrowed as he stared at Garrett and Wren, but lit up when he saw the princess. "Edward, would you mind opening the door for us? May I know who these two are, Your Highness?" "They're friends of mine. Garrett has been a tremendous help over the last few weeks." Despite the fact that he was stuck in the basement, guarding the door to a dusty room, Edward seemed to have a good grasp on the state of things. His eyes gleamed as he looked over Garrett once more. "You're the Klein boy," he said. "I know your father well." "Yes, sir. I am." "Well, if you're with the princess, I shouldn't have to worry. But make sure you don't stay in there too long. It's not good for your health." With that, Edward stepped aside and hit a panel on the side of the door, causing the entire thing to rumble open. With Wren pushing him and the princess walking a few steps in front, Garrett entered the room, his eyes immediately sweeping over everything. There were dozens of mysterious objects lying scattered throughout the room, resting on small pillars. But the one he was most interested in wasn't on a pillar at all. Instead, it was a large crystal that hung unsupported from the ceiling. A mysterious thrumming surrounded it as it turned slowly in the air, and Garrett could see wisps of power being pulled from it into the ceiling, where there was a complicated-looking fractured mirror. Noticing Garrett's gaze, the princess laughed. "It is rather mysterious, isn't it? I don't know what it does, but my uncle tells me it's of utmost importance." Chapter 38. Even a dozen feet away, Garrett could feel the intense, suppressive power of the artifact in front of him. This was the source of the protective bubble that should have shrouded the palace. However, it was clear that something was wrong with it. The mirror that should have refracted the crystal's energy to spread out throughout the palace had spots that were cloudy, obscuring portions of the palace from the suppressive force the crystal produced. On the surface, everything seemed to be fine, as if it was working normally. But the slight smudging on the mirror drastically reduced its strength, making it so weak that it hadn't even been able to pick up the dream flowers riding along with the princess when she returned to the palace. Having just felt the energy exuded by Victor, and seen the nightmares attached to various maids and guards, Garrett immediately knew what was going on. Coupled with the words spoken by the guard at the gate moments earlier, Garrett was 100% confident that he was looking at the work of his father. At first, Garrett hadn't understood why Victor Klein may have wanted to reduce the effectiveness of the supernatural shield around the palace. He had assumed that Victor's plan revolved around a physical confrontation. But after meeting the Duke, it was clear that there was no way a direct confrontation of physical force would work. The Duke's strength was simply too great, greater even than either of the dream rulers Garrett had faced. He had assumed that they were in the Shaper level, but given the immense sense of pressure Duke Arkoff released, even without flexing his aura, Garrett was now coming to understand that they had only been at the top of the Shaper stage. Victor must have realized the same, and rather than engaging in a direct confrontation, he was clearly planning something completely different. Garrett had no idea how he intended to deal with the Duke. But considering how Victor was bringing nightmares into the palace, Garrett could only assume that it would be through the use of the dream. Remembering his own experience with Kabod's maze, Garrett thought that it was possible mysterious artifacts would be involved. Regardless, it was obvious that one of the forces from the dream was meddling in the waking world. Garrett's suspicion landed firmly on the Crimson Eye of Shemorth. He had been surprised to find the Crimson Eye listed nowhere in the city as a ruler, which meant that it was a great ruler from beyond the city walls. Its chosen had ranged through Insomnium when Garrett first arrived. But after defeating the possessed Henrik, Garrett hadn't encountered any of the Crimson Eye's forces. Until, that is, he felt the energy his father wielded. There was no chance that Garrett would ever forget the feeling of the Crimson Eye's possession. And even now, when he thought of the eyes opening all across his body, it was all he could do to keep from shivering. Just over an hour earlier, when his father had surrounded him in the power of the dream, Garrett had felt that same force. Catching sight of the faint, bloody color in his father's eyes had only further reinforced his suspicions. If it was true that the Crimson Eye of Shemorth was using his father to make a play for the city, intending to place its own ruler in the city, Garrett knew that the fight for the throne was about to get a lot more difficult. At the same time, he could tell that his father didn't actually know how to wield the power of the dream, and may not even have known that he was possessed, as he clearly hadn't noticed the dream flowers surrounding Garrett. Of course, there was always the possibility that Victor was simply a good actor. But given his intimate knowledge of his father, Garrett seriously doubted it. He thought it much more likely that the Crimson Eye of Shemorth, or potentially one of its chosen, was manipulating Victor without the steward knowing it. And if that was the case, Garrett was confident in his victory. Seeing that Garrett was still staring up at the crystal, the princess began to look around, poking through the rest of the room, until Garrett suddenly called her over. "Princess, why is it that when I try to get close to the crystal, it pushes me away?" This was a serious question. As Garrett had rolled closer to it, he had found a suppressive force pressing him back, not allowing him to come within arm's reach. "It's because it's a blood-bonded crystal," the princess replied. "The crystal has been bonded to the blood of the royal family, which means we're the only ones who can control it. See?" As she spoke, she took a step forward and touched the crystal, before looking proudly back at Garrett, who had a suitably awestruck expression on his face. "Wow, that's really impressive," he said, causing the princess to smile widely. At the same time, Garrett's power surged, sending out half a dozen dream seeds from the princess's dream flowers. Thanks to the connection the dream flower had with the princess, the seeds didn't burn up as soon as they got close to the crystal, like the ones Garrett had sent out had done, and instead burrowed into it, causing the crystal to shiver for a moment. For a brief and terrible second, Garrett wondered if he had accidentally broken the thing, as its energy flickered. Thankfully, it returned strong, and a moment later, invisible to everyone's eyes apart from Garrett's, dozens of blooms erupted from the crystal, nourished by the intense mental energy that formed its core. Garrett had no idea whether infesting the crystal with flowers would be of any help, but he figured it was something he could explore slowly later. Edward, who had felt the tremble in the crystal's energy, stepped into the room, his brow furrowed when he saw the princess touching its smooth side. "Your Highness." Looking like a little girl caught with her hand in the cookie jar, the princess quickly pulled her hand back and stepped away. "I was just talking to Garrett about the function of the mind crystal," the princess said. He was curious, since he couldn't get close to it. Glancing between Garrett and the princess, Edward nodded. "It serves as one of the defenses for the palace," he said. "It identifies any time a foreign entity enters the palace, and those of royal blood can wield it to eliminate them." "Foreign entities? What are those?" Garrett asked, looking at the princess, who shrugged, and then at Edward. The old man scratched his beard and shrugged as well. "You know, ghosts, stuff like that. Mysterious artifacts, which have the same sort of aura as ghosts. Mysterious artifacts can be quite dangerous, so it's better to not have them brought into the palace. That's why the mind crystal is so important. If a mysterious artifact is brought into the palace, the mind crystal will alert every member of the royal family, allowing them to identify where it is and track it." "Have you ever experienced such a thing?" Garrett asked the princess. After a moment of consideration, she nodded. "Sort of. I mean, there are mysterious artifacts in the palace. They are just all gathered in this room right here. Well, except for a few others, but those are held by specific individuals. It's hard to describe, but it's like I have a feeling for where they are in the palace at any given time." "It's an impressive system," Garrett said, glancing at the crystal again. "And I'm glad to know that it's there to keep you safe." "Princess, it's time to leave," Edward said. "After all, staying in here isn't a good idea. Some of these mysterious artifacts can have a negative impact if you're around them too long." Seeing that Rin was beginning to push Garrett out of the room, the princess nodded and followed close behind. Once they were out, Edward carefully locked the door behind them, and they headed up the stairs to the first floor of the palace. It was almost lunchtime, but Garrett declined the princess's invitation. Before he left, however, he pulled something out of his pocket and held it up for her to see. "Princess, I know you're safe here in the palace, but it would ease my mind if you would wear this." "What is it?" the princess asked, taking the small necklace. There was a charm on the end of it, gleaming polished silver, formed into the shape of a flower with 5 petals. A faint texture decorated one side, and as the princess moved it in the light, she saw iridescent ripples running across it. "You might think of it as a good luck charm," Garrett said. "I know it's silly, but the people in the northern district swear by it. If you keep it on your body, it will be able to protect you, even when everything seems to have gone wrong." Though she didn't know why, the princess felt like the charm was particularly attractive. "Thank you. Miss Rin, would you do me the honor of putting it on me?" "Of course, Your Highness." Taking the chain from her, Rin carefully fastened it around the princess's neck. "You don't have to wear it on the chain," Garrett said as the princess stepped back and admired the flower once more. "Just keep the charm on you, preferably outside of your clothing." After they had left the palace, Garrett asked Rin to pause, and for a moment they remained on the palace steps, before he opened his eyes and smiled. "Thank you. We can go back now." Rather than take the royal coach, they hired a coach to take them back to the northern district. While it was significantly less comfortable than the royal coach, it didn't cause nearly the stir, which made Garrett quite happy. They arrived back at the inn, where Garrett found 2 people waiting for him. One was Thomas Galavin, looking quite harassed, while the other was Jero Twinblade. When they saw Garrett, both got to their feet at once, and then exchanged glances. Jero gestured to Thomas for him to go first, while he repeated the gesture towards her. "Please, I insist," the young nobleman said. "Ever the gentleman, Thomas," Jero said with a smile. "I've just come to let you know that I've delivered the goods you asked for," she said, turning to Garrett. "They were a bugger, and dangerous too, nearly chewed my hands off. Anyway, I put them down in the basement, though they won't survive long without more water." "Thank you," Garrett said. "I'll be able to handle them from here." With a nod, Jero moved to leave, but Thomas quickly stopped her. "You'll want to stay to hear this too," he said. "In fact, if you stay, it'll save me one more trip. An emergency meeting of the 10 seats has been called. Given the uncertainty over the political future of the city, multiple members have recommended that we meet and discuss what we are going to do." Thomas spoke as if he was reciting a speech he had given before, and looking at his disheveled appearance, it was likely that he had. "We'll be meeting tonight. Sorry for the short notice, but given how volatile the situation is, we thought it best to strike while the iron was hot." "Whew. All right, that's done. I need a drink. You two were the last, so after this I can actually go get some sleep. You know, I was up till 7 this morning at a party, and I stumble home only to find that I've been elected spokesperson. Miserable. I spent all morning tramping all over this city just to deliver a message that could have gone by courier," he said. Gesturing for the bartender to give Thomas a drink, Garrett frowned. "Who's calling the meeting?" he asked. "Silver Song, Telabran, Marble Griffins, and the Hunters," Thomas said. "And honestly, the Moonlight Council thinks it's a good idea as well, so Rakam's Blade is involved." With more than half of the gangs agreeing, "Well, here we are. I need to take a nap, though, before tonight, as I imagine it's going to be a long meeting." Slamming back his drink, Thomas put his glass on the bar, took a deep breath, nodded to Garrett and Jero, and took his leave. "Sounds like they're up to their old tricks," Jero said. "Have you had trouble with them before?" Garrett asked, watching as Thomas boarded a carriage in the yard outside. "Yes. Silver Song and Telabran are particularly troublesome, constantly reaching for more power. Whatever they propose probably isn't in our best interest." "Thank you for the warning," Garrett said. "I'll keep that in mind." Glancing at the young man, Jero hesitated, as if she wanted to say something. Ultimately, though, she kept quiet and took her leave. The rest of the day Garrett spent dealing with the large, watertight crates that had been delivered into his basement. They were heavily chained, but even then, thumps and thrashing could be heard from inside of them. Garrett called Elrissa and her necromancers to come and pick them up, sending them down into the tunnels under the city. Each crate contained one or more live fishmen, a sort of humanoid fish monster native to the swamp. The awakened dreamers had reported seeing them in the dream, so Garrett was interested in seeing if it was possible to crossbreed them with the dream flowers in the same way that the flower ghouls had. While the flower ghouls could swim and didn't need to breathe, they weren't particularly fast or agile underwater, whereas the fishmen were completely in tune to that environment. The fishmen weren't the only monsters Garrett was interested in testing to see if he could make hybrids, and once the situation with the princess was stabilized, he planned to turn the tunnels under the noble district that contained trolls and goblins into his personal laboratory. The thought of having an army of 9 destructible flower trolls put a smile on his normally impassive face. Around dinner time, Garrett called Rin into his office. When she came, she was munching on a drumstick and held a plate piled high with food. "Francis says you need to eat something," she said, putting the plate down and sliding it over. Though it all looked good, Garrett wasn't particularly hungry. Instead, he directed his gaze towards Rin. "Tell me, if I gave you an opportunity that would allow you to grow more powerful, but at the cost of some of your freedom, would you take it?" Lowering the drumstick, Rin licked her lips, her expression growing serious. "It's a really good question," she said. "I think I'd have to know more about the opportunity." Chapter 39. Do you know how Jero became one of our allies? Taking another bite of chicken, Rin shook her head. "The reason she became our ally is simple," Garrett said. "She gained access to a particular kind of power. You've been to Dreamer's Rest, and you've seen the VIP area, but there's another place beyond that, for those who serve the Dreamer on the throne. Jero had the opportunity to become one of the Dreamer's chosen, allowing her to wield a limited amount of his power. As she grows in ability, the amount of power she can access will grow as well. Additionally, it allows for those of us who serve the dreamer to interact in a more regular way. So what do these chosen do? Rin asked, her eyes narrowing. As of yet, nothing really, Garrett admitted. But I was curious if you would be interested in the role. That's one I'd have to think about, Rin said. I do value my freedom, but I'm also always interested in more power. She put the drumstick down and held out her hand, flexing her fingers. I never understood the allure before, but ever since I was awakened, I admit I've grown quite addicted to the feeling. I know exactly what you mean, Garrett said. Once you begin taking up power, it's very hard not to strive for more. Will there be other chosen? I mean beyond just Jero and me if I choose to take the position. There will, Garrett said. In fact, I have a particular person in mind. Let me guess, you're not going to tell me who? No, I think I'll leave it for a surprise. Rolling her eyes, Rin took another bite of chicken and put the now empty bone on the plate. Why me? She asked, licking her fingers. For 2 reasons, really, Garrett said. First, you're exceptional, and I can't see where the limit of your growth is going to be, though it's exceptionally unlikely that you'll ever be more powerful than I am. Your soul spark continues to grow stronger, even when you don't do anything, which tells me that I want to keep you as close as possible. Second, at some point, probably in the next year, you're going to Port Reverie, and this will give you an added layer of protection. Tucking her hair behind her ear, Rin slowly smiled. You know, I always knew that picking you up out of the gutter was a good idea. I'm touched that you care for me. I honestly didn't know if you cared about anybody. I do have a tendency to be rather detached, don't I? Garrett said with a smile. That is an understatement, Garrett. A criminal understatement. You know what? Yes, let's do it. I'm already in the family, so I might as well go all the way, right? What do I need to do? Nothing, Garrett said. Reaching into the air, his wrist twisted, and he seemed to pull a golden mask from nothing. You can use this one instead of your black one, he said, sliding it across the desk. Picking it up, Rin gave Garrett a long look as she turned the mask over in her hands. Does anybody else know? She asked. Know what? That you're the dreamer on the throne. Considering for a moment, Garrett shook his head. No, he said. No one else knows, and I intend to keep it that way. You'll have to bear the burden of being my anchor all by yourself. Taking a deep breath, Rin nodded. That's fine, she said. I'm up for the challenge. Later that night, after darkness had fallen over the city, but before they went down underground toward the arena, Garrett sat on the dreamer's throne and sent out a call. At the same time, he shifted into the stone hall where the dreamer on the throne held court. One by one, figures began to appear, as those he had called entered the dream. Each wore their mask, and when Jero caught sight of another golden-masked figure, she hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward to say hello. Though it would have been easy for Garrett to use the power of the dream to make it impossible for anyone to tell who the other masked figures were, he felt as if that would spoil some of the advantage of what he was trying to do. Instead, he let them interact freely as he sat on the throne, towering over them. You're Rin, right? Jero asked. Her eyes narrowed as she scrutinized the new, golden-masked figure. At your service, Madam Twinblade. Smirking under her mask at Rin's flippant response, Jero was about to unleash a hint of her Shaper-level aura when she realized with a start that the aura Rin had wasn't much weaker. While Jero's was sharp and biting, like a cold wind, Rin's was deep and mysterious, and carried a heavy scent of danger and darkness. Taking a deep breath, Jero reined in her ego. The last time she had seen Rin, she was positive that the young woman was in the lighting stage. But now, the feeling she gave off was clearly of the Shaper stage, which meant that either she was so strong that she could hide her aura, or that she had grown faster than anyone Jero had ever encountered. The truth was that as soon as Rin accepted the appointment as a chosen, the power of the throne had flowed through her, forcefully accelerating the condensing of her soul spark and causing her to naturally enter the Shaper level. Her soul spark, though blurry, appeared to be a dark raven, wings outstretched, whose feathers bled into darkness that trailed behind it. This was the soul of the black raven that Rin had inherited from the crypt in Port Reverie. Though her soul spark had yet to stabilize, the power it gave off was unmistakable, and Jero was quite pleased, as it meant that the Klein family had another shaper level awakened. At this point, Jero was more than confident that the Klein family could go up against any force in the city and emerge victorious. Even without using the flower ghouls who were rapidly reproducing underneath the city, or the necromancers hidden in the first tomb, the Klein family would be able to go toe-to-toe with anyone apart from the Duke himself. And once he accumulated enough experience points, Garrett was confident in beating even him. Once Rin and Jero had been introduced to each other in their roles as chosen, the giant on the throne finally spoke to them. "I'm aware that you have a meeting to go to, so I won't keep you long, but I did want to take the opportunity to have the two of you meet. Additionally, I have a job for each of you." Immediately, both women stood up straight and faced the giant. Jero's expression was serious, as this was the first genuine task that she had been given. Having tasted the bit of power that her appointment had given her, she was eager to perform well and earn more. Standing next to her, Rin had a slightly teasing expression in her eyes as she stared up at the giant, who she knew to be Garrett. For a moment, Garrett wondered if he had made a mistake in having her as one of his chosen, but seeing how she quickly adjusted her expression to match Jero's, he put his worry out of his mind. "As you know, it is my desire to support the princess as the next queen, and more than that, to ensure a stable rule for her. After all, though fishing can be easier in chaotic waters, it's only when the city is at peace that we can truly grow and develop. Jero, in addition to mapping the swamp, I need you to begin working to take over the 10 seats. Garrett and the Klein family can assist you in this, and Sinan of the Grave Walkers will provide any muscle you need. How you do it is up to you, just see that it gets done." Her eyes gleaming, Jero bowed. "It will be done, my lord." "Good. Rin, I have a different task for you. The nobles are involved in many schemes. Discover who is allied with who, and what sort of power plays the nobles are planning. It will be a gift to Princess Eloise to celebrate her coming inauguration. That is all." "I hear and obey," Rin said, bowing. Before she had straightened up, Garrett was gone from the throne, and one by one the others in the stone hall faded as well, leaving Rin and Jero alone. "If you need any help," Rin said, "let me know. You certainly got the harder of the tasks." She had fully expected Jero to brush off her offer, but to her surprise, the leader of the Ebony Alliance nodded heavily. "Truthfully, I could use any help I can get, so I'll take you up on it, and I'll let you know if there's anything you can do." In the waking world, Garrett opened his eyes and stretched, more from force of habit than anything else. With the new improvements to his physical body, he rarely felt fatigue or experienced any of the aches and pains that typically came from remaining in one place for a long time. A few minutes later, Rin arrived and knocked on his door. After he had wheeled himself into the hallway, she pushed him into the great room, where there were half a dozen awakened waiting for them, and together they headed down into the basement, entering the tunnel system that led to the underground arena. Since they were a bit early, Garrett had Rin push him around the black market to see if he could find anything interesting. A surprising amount of the goods were things he recognized, as they had come through the tunnels controlled by the Klein family. There were other, more exotic items, however, scattered throughout the market that Garrett found quite interesting. These included colorful feathers that were hard as steel, savage-looking weapons made from natural materials that carried some sort of enchantment, making them nearly impossible to break, and texts in unknown languages. What Garrett found rather surprising was the relative lack of mysterious artifacts. Though, on further reflection, it made some sense, as few individuals wanted to handle such dangerous objects. The mysterious artifacts he did identify were all hidden in and among the other items, and as they strolled around, Garrett instructed Ob to purchase them. By the time the other members of the 10 seats had gathered, Garrett had a nice little haul, including a blue and red feather that weighed almost 3 pounds and clanked like metal whenever he tapped on it, an old bronze key, and a silver cup that happened to have the same motif as the plate Isabel currently possessed. Garrett didn't actually know what the three mysterious artifacts did, or what was special about them. He could just feel the power of the dream that infused them. So he bought them, intending to explore their use later. Rather than carry them around directly, he took out the small box he carried, and with a thought, infused a little bit of power into it. The box shook slightly, and the three mysterious artifacts disappeared, sucked into it. "Hold these for me. Make sure they don't go crazy." Though the warden couldn't reply directly, Garrett felt Kabod's mace shake slightly, indicating the spirit's agreement. Putting Kabod's mace away, Garrett and Rin made their way up to the central platform, where the other members of the 10 seats were beginning to gather. One by one, they took their places, with Garrett transferring himself from his wheelchair into the large, straight-back chair that bore the symbol of his guild, which had been made for him after his successful election to the council. Thomas was the last to arrive, looking much refreshed, no doubt having taken a nap that afternoon. Apart from Garrett, everyone else was standing, and once Thomas had taken his place, they all sat down together. "Welcome, and thank you all for coming on such short notice," Thomas said. "Rather than begin with the normal preamble, I think it only appropriate that I turn the floor over to those who called this meeting. Chief among them, Louise." Leaning back in his chair, Thomas gestured towards the leader of Silversong. "Why don't you go ahead and get us started?" he said. With a nod towards Thomas, Louise stood up and looked around the table, her gaze hesitating ever so slightly when she reached Garrett, before passing on to Henrianus, who was next to him. As Thomas said, "Thank you all so much for coming. I know that this meeting was probably disruptive to your schedules, but it is an exceptionally important topic. We are about to enter a new era, and it only behooves us to meet and decide what it is we're going to do." "Just cut to the chase, Louise," Garrett snapped from across the table, flashing a not-so-friendly smile. Louise nodded. "Fine. Our network has uncovered 3 major factions vying for political power in the city, all centered around the coming inauguration of Princess Louise. The princess is being crowned." "Why hadn't I heard of this?" Arthur Telson asked. "The information is brand new," Louise replied, "but it poses a significant problem for us. On the heels of such an event, it's likely that the city guard will crack down on illegal activity in order to show the power of the new monarch. However, I think there are a few ways to get around this. First is probably the worst option. We can lay low. And when I say we, I mean all of us. If we can reduce our activity for the next 6 months, it's likely that we'll be able to resume normal operations without any major repercussions." 6 months is a long time to be operating at half profit, Jonathan Moran said. "I know, which is why I say it's the worst option," Louise replied. "You mentioned a few factions," Thomas chimed in, leaning forward. "Who are they?" 3 different groups of nobles," Louise said, holding up 3 fingers. "The first supports the princess. Unfortunately, allying ourselves with them means practically shutting down for the next 6 months. The second group supports Duke Arkov to remain as regent, even after the princess is made queen. The third supports a clean break from the monarchy. And you can imagine what joining them will entail." Many of the eyes at the table glanced towards Thomas Galavin, causing him to chuckle and hold up his hands. "Don't look at me," he said. "I'm not part of any of those groups. My loyalties lie here with all of you." Nobody believed that for a single second, but that didn't bother Thomas one bit. Looking around the table again, Louise smiled, clearly pleased with the effect she had created, and then sat down, intending to let everyone else argue about their course of action. Chapter 40. "I think this is a lot of foolishness," Jero said, standing up and staring directly at Louise. "Since when have we gotten involved in the politics of the city? That's a game for the nobles to play, not us." "Normally, I would agree with you," Jonathan Moran said, getting laboriously to his feet. "But this," he paused and tapped the table with a meaty finger for emphasis, "this is a situation that will affect us deeply. We have the opportunity for a tremendous growth, but in it lies danger that could crush all of us." "Speak for yourself," Jero said with a sneer. "The Ebony Association will come through just fine." Henry Giannis from Giannis Manor agreed. Yana's manor also isn't likely to be affected. We have enough legitimate business that we don't have to worry about a crackdown. Before Louise could jump back into the conversation, Jero turned to Vent Deland from the Marble Griffins. What about you, Vent? Do you care who sits on the throne? The old soldier thought about it for a moment and then shook his head. No, it matters not to us. Our goal is to protect the gate and the families who live around it. We have no interest in the power plays among the nobility. Arthur, how does the Adventurers Guild feel about getting involved in politics? Suddenly put on the spot, Arthur Telson shifted uncomfortably, his gaze going back and forth between Louise and Jero. I think that we would be foolish to ignore the potential opportunities. After all, if we play our cards right, we could increase the amount of power this council wields substantially. It was a safe answer. And judging from the annoyed look on Louise's face, not the one that she wanted from him. Sinan. What about you and the Grave Walkers? Jero asked. The task of the Grave Walkers is clear, and we will not deviate from it. The more members of the 10 seats that turned down Louise's proposal, the happier Jero got. She turned to Thomas and Carl Rackham, who sat next to him. How does the Moonlight Council stand on this issue? I know you said you're not involved in any of the factions so far, but given your family connections, I imagine it's hard to avoid being entangled in it. There's some truth to that, Thomas replied. But at the end of the day, I'm me, and my father is my father. He firmly supports the princess, though wouldn't be opposed to seeing the nobility have the opportunity to shoulder more of the ruler's burden. As for the Moonlight Council, we'll continue to operate, regardless of what happens. The privilege of birth, you might say. What about you, Rackham? What do you think? Rackham didn't reply for a minute, and when he did, he simply shrugged. So far, Jero said, flashing a smile at Louise, 6 of us don't want anything to do with this. 1 of us is undecided, and 2 are in favor. It seems to me that we've already made our decision. But then, just to be fair, Klein, where do you stand on this issue? Smiling slightly, Garrett waved his hand. I don't stand anywhere, he said, causing a few chuckles around the table. But that aside, I'm afraid I see this whole situation a little bit differently than everyone else. Oh. With all attention on him, Garrett took his time to answer, as if gathering his thoughts. We really only have one option, he said, and that is to support the princess. Ignoring the stir that his words caused, Garrett held up his finger. There's only one thing that matters, and that is that Duke Arkoff is in the manifesting stage, and is intent on seeing Eloise firmly established as Queen of Insomnium. It is practically guaranteed that we are going to see the return of the Bloody Duke. And so, regardless of what the rest of you decide, the Klein family would be laying low, so as not to catch the attention of that working disaster. The expressions of everyone around the table were a mixture of fear and disbelief. And after a long moment, it was Thomas who leaned forward. How positive are you that the Duke has risen to the manifesting stage? 100%, Garrett replied calmly. And the manifesting stage, is it that powerful? Carl Rackham leaned forward, his normally impassive face twisted into a bitter expression. It's more powerful than you can imagine, Rackham said. Someone in the manifesting stage could kill all of us here within a few seconds. If what Garrett says is true, then he is correct. We have no choice but to lay low. Of everyone there, Louise was the one who looked the most put out. The strength of her gang was in their information network. Yet apart from some vague rumors, they had heard nothing about the Duke's power. While she was inclined to believe that Garrett was just making it up, she knew better than to call him out directly. Instead, she casually glanced to the side, giving Jonathan Moran a hidden signal. You say you're 100% sure? The fat merchant said, dabbing at the beads of sweat that appeared on his forehead with a handkerchief. But what proof do you have? First-hand proof, Garrett replied casually. As you all probably already know, I was in the palace this morning to receive a reward from Princess Eloise for my contribution in helping her arrive back at the palace safely. To my surprise, Duke Arkoff was there, and the aura he gave off was unmistakable. I'm well acquainted with the level of power possessed by Shapers, Garrett gestured around the room, as I'm surrounded by it almost constantly. But the aura the Duke gave off was on a different level. It completely crushed the resistance of everybody in the room. And that was when he was restrained. I can only imagine what would have happened if he had actually unleashed his aura. It was such a qualitative difference that there's only one reasonable possibility. Duke Arkoff is a manifester. Slapping the table, Jero stood up, giving Garrett an annoyed glare. You know, if you had just told us that at the beginning, we could have saved ourselves this whole conversation. But now there's clearly no need to continue. Like the Klein family, the Ebony Association will be laying low as well. Her words re-echoed around the table, as one by one, each of the gangs declared their intentions to tone down their activities and withdraw from the public eye. None of them would give up control over their territory, or even stop their actions completely. The tacit understanding was that it was time to duck their heads and avoid standing out. This was not the outcome Silver Song had been hoping for. And judging from the stormy look on Louisa's face, she was furious. Still, she couldn't go against the rest of the council, and she knew just as well as anyone how foolhardy it would be to try and make big moves with the Duke breathing down their neck. As the meeting broke up, Garrett saw Carl Rackham walking around the table towards him. The others, noticing Rackham's movement, delayed, curious what he was going to say. When the mercenary leader arrived in front of Garrett, he bowed. I want to apologize for the actions of my men the other night, he said. Before he could continue, Garrett interrupted. You have nothing to apologize for. I'm still responsible for them, Rackham said, but Garrett just waved it off. I understand, and I think it's an admirable way of leading. But they didn't do anything wrong. In fact, if anything, they helped me establish my prestige. Able to read the sincerity in Garrett's voice, Rackham nodded and left the issue. With nothing left to talk about, Garrett called Ren over, and they left, returning to the inn. The next few days were quiet, and Garrett spent some time understanding the mysterious artifacts that he had retrieved from the black market. The feather was the simplest. The more mental energy was put into it, the heavier it became. The key was even more mysterious. When it was stimulated with mental energy, it would vanish, only to reappear sometime later. Garrett could tell that the key was moving in between the dream world and the waking world. But what it could be used for, he had no idea. The last of the three mysterious artifacts was a cup bearing the same pattern as the plate that could turn food into fish. Similarly, the cup transformed everything that the target drank into salt water. Since he didn't have a particular use for them, Garrett sent them into the world behind the mirror, for Isabel, since she enjoyed collecting such trinkets. 4 days after the 10 seats had convened, word spread throughout the city of the princess's inauguration, to be held a month later. Immediately, a flurry of activity broke out, as everyone began to prepare. The ascension of a new king or queen was an exceptionally important time in the city. Not only would the palace be lavishly decorated for an extravagant party, but the citizens would be given leave to celebrate as well. Restaurants began ordering more food and drink, wanting to be ready for the citizens who would take to the streets. Many began constructing outdoor seating, since the entire city would be celebrating. Garrett was busy as well. It seemed that every day he got requests from the different groups as they plotted and counter-plotted. The princess was in deep negotiation with the nobles who supported her, trying to hammer out details of the council that she would form as her first act as queen. Although Garrett wasn't in any of those meetings, the princess would often request his assistance, sending him mental messages containing the proposed details and asking for his opinion. At the same time, Baron Galavin's faction also reached out, asking him to help persuade the princess at one point or another. Finally, the closer the inauguration day came, the more often Garrett heard from Victor as his father prepared his own plans. Excitement continued to build in the city, along with a strong undercurrent of tension. Through all of it, Garrett did his best to balance the requests from each group, while at the same time finalizing his own preparations. The month passed swiftly, and soon the morning of the inauguration came. The city was bustling as everyone put the finishing touches on their preparations, or cleared the last bits of work from their plates, in order to get ready for the 3-day party that was about to take place. Garrett had received one of the gold-edged invitations to witness the inauguration at the palace, and that morning he took extra care as he got ready. Rin would come with him, but they would be the only members of the Klein family attending. They set out early, even before the sun had risen, yet the city was still full of people rushing this way and that. It took an hour longer than normal to get to the palace, and even after they arrived, they found the gate jammed with carriages dropping off various nobles. The Duke had gone all out for his niece, and no one wanted to miss the event. It took another hour to get into the palace itself, and once they had finally made it through the doors, one of the servants directed them to the large ballroom, where they could get light refreshments as they waited to enter the throne room. The invitation they held included the opportunity to witness the crowning ceremony itself, but that wouldn't be for another 4 hours, and so Rin pushed Garrett through the halls heading for the ballroom. In the last month, the palace had almost completely transformed, as decorations were added to make it look even more impressive. The halls practically overflowed with flowers placed in large pots near the windows, and beautiful cloth had been hung from the ceiling, creating an almost ethereal feeling. Everything had been burnished to a near-mirror finish, and glowing crystals had been placed in braziers everywhere the eye turned. The nobles, scattered around the hall in small groups, had spared no expense on their clothing, and Garrett could feel Rin practically drooling behind him as she looked at all of the gems that surrounded them. They made their way into the ballroom, finding a corner, and a servant soon approached, with a tray that held various delicacies. After waiting for half an hour, another servant arrived, this time requesting their presence in a small adjoining room. Under the envious gazes of many in the ballroom, Rin and Garrett made their way into the small room, where they met the soon-to-be queen. As soon as they saw her, both bowed. "You look lovely, Your Highness," Garrett said, causing Eloise to smile happily. "It is a beautiful dress, isn't it?" she said, smoothing a wrinkle out of the skirt. "I apologize that I don't have much time, but I just wanted to tell you once again how incredibly grateful I am for all of your help. I take it the negotiations went well, then?" "Yes. Your proposals were brilliant, and the nobles have all agreed. I'll be making the announcement tomorrow, on the 2nd day of the celebration, and on the 3rd day we'll release the list of names of individuals who are being considered. Per your suggestion, they won't automatically be appointed, but instead we'll have to get a certain number of signatures from those who are not going to be on the council. Additionally, we've limited it to 10 seats for the nobles, and 4 seats for the leaders of the various industries in the city." "It sounds like you achieved complete success," Garrett said, looking impressed. "It's an incredibly impressive feat, considering you aren't yet queen." "I was helped by the excellence of the ideas," Princess Eloise said, flashing a smile. "And my uncle's glare might have had something to do with it as well." That caused Garrett to chuckle. "Indeed, having Duke Arkoff on your side is probably the greatest advantage you could ask for." Seeing a servant step into the room and look meaningfully at the soon-to-be queen, Garrett bowed once more. "I won't take up any more of your time, Your Highness. Congratulations on your incredible achievement. I know that you will be a wonderful ruler for this city." Taking a deep breath, the princess nodded. Though she seemed to want to say more, she held her tongue as Garrett and Rin left the room to give her time to prepare for the upcoming ceremony. Chapter 41. After returning to the ballroom, Garrett was approached a few times by some of the nobles who recognized him, and the hours leading up to the crowning ceremony were filled with small talk. When the time came, there was a trumpet blast silencing the conversation in the room, and the chief steward stood up in front of the crowd. Victor was dressed to perfection, and his warm gaze swept over the assembled nobles. "In half an hour, the crowning ceremony of our new queen will begin. A joyous occasion for Insomnium and all its citizens. I would invite those with gold-edged invitations to make their way to the throne room to find your assigned seating." Under the envious gazes of the crowd, around 100 people began to move towards the throne room, Garrett and Rin among them. In the throne room, seats had been set up for all of those watching, and Garrett found an empty space waiting for him to park his wheelchair. Once Rin was seated beside him, he directed his attention to the throne, where Duke Arkoff stood. On the throne itself was a large pillow, and on the pillow, a glittering crown that Garrett had last seen on the late king's head. It was thick and heavy, and seemed to hold a tremendous weight. Garrett only needed a glance to know that it was a mysterious artifact, though what its function was, he wasn't sure. The more he explored the palace, the clearer it was becoming that the attack against the royal family had been both meticulously planned and an inside job. From his interactions with Arkoff, however, Garrett genuinely didn't believe the Duke had anything to do with it. Yet if that was the case, then it must have been somebody else with intimate access to the royal family. Though Garrett didn't want to jump to any conclusions, he already knew what that meant. Slowly, his gaze drifted over to where Victor Klein stood, at the bottom of the steps leading up to the throne. He looked every part the loyal servant. Not a hint of deceit or ambition could be found anywhere on him. Yet Garrett knew just how duplicitous his father was, as his father had been before him. "What are you thinking about?" Rin asked, as she saw a small smile on Garrett's face. "I'm just thinking that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree," Garrett said with a laugh. "Like father, like son." Before she could question him further, there was another trumpet blast, and the ceremony got underway. It was a relatively simple affair that consisted of Duke Arkoff making a small speech, and then inviting Princess Eloise to come to the throne. As she stood in front of it, the Duke reached down and lifted up the crown from the pillow. "The right to rule has been granted to you by birth, but in truth, it comes from another place. This crown represents the will of the people, the burden of their lives. Bear it well, Queen Eloise." As he finished speaking, Duke Arkoff lowered the crown onto Eloise's head, and Garrett felt a rumble of power as the crown flashed brightly, causing the room to light up. It shone with a light pure and bright, causing all who looked on Eloise to feel their souls tremble. It was a full minute before the glow surrounding the new queen faded. When it finally did, everyone in the room stood and bowed toward the throne. Moving slowly, as if still getting used to the weight of the crown on her head, Eloise sat on the throne. Duke Arkoff's voice filled the room. "All hail, Queen Eloise. May your reign be long and prosperous." Those words were echoed by everyone in the throne room. Once more, Garrett felt a shift in the air as a wave of mental energy expanded around the queen. With the ceremony over, Queen Eloise thanked everybody for coming and dismissed them. Next, she would address the nobles gathered in the ballroom, and the first party would begin. According to the schedule that had been laid out, parties would continue for the next 3 days. But the reality was that the city had already begun to celebrate. The streets were filled with citizens laughing and drinking as they waited for the Queen's address that afternoon. Not everyone gathered at the palace was having a good time, however. Garrett could feel the tension among many of the nobles. Whether they knew something was going to happen or not didn't seem to matter, as there was a clear sense that disaster was about to strike. The first thing Garrett noticed was more and more guards filtering into various parts of the palace, every single one of them carrying a nightmare. Many of the servants were the same, and it was the presence of so many nightmares that seemed to be putting the nobles on edge. As the tension peaked, Garrett asked Rin to take him to try and find the princess. But before he could, there was a loud shout, and suddenly the windows to the ballroom exploded, sending shards of glass flying. Immediately, chaos reigned as dozens of black-clothed figures rushed through the broken windows, gleaming weapons in their hands. At the same time, the guards pulled their weapons and rushed into the crowd, as if they were going to fight against the black-clothed assailants. Closing his eyes, Garrett located the queen in one of the adjoining rooms, only to realize that Duke Arkoff wasn't by her side. The Duke was all the way across the castle. But before Garrett could try and figure out why, one of the dark-clothed attackers rushed towards him. He wasn't necessarily targeting Garrett specifically, but rather was aiming for the group of nobles Garrett was with. Rin acted immediately, power surging from her soul spark, as she stepped in front of Garrett to block the attacker's sword. She was barehanded, as bringing weapons into the palace wasn't allowed. But the increase in power becoming a shaper had given her was more than enough to disarm the man and impale him on his own sword. A brief flash of terror crossed the man's eyes, and his mouth moved as if he wanted to say something. Before he could, however, his body exploded, scattering flesh and blood across the room. Just before he erupted, Rin had sensed something and jumped back, pulling up shadow like a cloak around her to block the force of the blast. As it faded, she turned to check if Garrett was okay, as the nobles nearby screamed and panicked. The explosion seemed to act as a signal, and within a few seconds, 3 more of the black-clothed assailants were torn apart, their bodies transforming into projectiles that wounded dozens of nobles and killed a few of the guards. Garrett, who had fully expected the attack, had never imagined that they'd be facing something like this. But his focus wasn't in the ballroom, but rather with the Queen, who was facing half a dozen more of these mysterious attackers. Garrett felt his soul tremble as his mind flashed back to the terrible memories of the last attack in the palace he had been caught up in. Though they dressed the same, he knew that these weren't members of Black Raven, like the previous attackers had been, but instead were death-sworn soldiers cultivated by Victor Klein for this very purpose. The guards, who had been struggling already, soon found themselves in an even worse position, as many of their number began to act erratically, screaming in fury and attacking everyone around them. Forced to deal both with the black-clothed assassins and their now insane comrades, the guards who hadn't been corrupted were soon overwhelmed. The guard captain, who was desperately fighting against 3 enemies, felt his heart catch as one of his trusted lieutenants suddenly raced towards him, madness painted across his face. Before the lieutenant could reach him, there was a blast and a section of the wall crumbled to pieces. Rolling green flames slammed into the crazed lieutenant, causing him to shriek in pain. Striding out through the hole in the wall, Sinon looked around the room, calmly surveying the chaos. "Take down the enemy," she said, and through the gap, hundreds of awakened began to rush into the room, all wearing the gray hooded uniform of the Gravewalkers. From the other end of the ballroom came a shout as the doors were forced open and Coleridge led the Cleaver's Edge mercenaries to fight against the assassins. "We need to find somewhere quiet," Garrett said. With Rin leading the way, Garrett maneuvered his wheelchair through the fighting as they headed towards the rooms that lay off of the ballroom. The first room was empty, but Garrett knew that the Queen was just beyond. He didn't proceed, however, and called for Rin to stop. "I need you to protect this room," he said. "Keep me safe." Her expression grim, Rin nodded as Garrett closed his eyes, wishing that he had access to the Dreamer's throne. The problem was that it was the middle of the day, and so his access to the dream was cut off. Still, he could feel the connection between his soul spark and the throne, and he drew as much strength from that as he could. All across the palace, everything was in chaos. Guards, possessed by nightmares, attacked their companions, and even the servants pulled out weapons and began to fight. There seemed to be hundreds of the dark-clothed assassins who threw themselves with abandon at everyone they saw. Only a few rooms away, Queen Eloise was facing the first crisis of her reign. Her face was pale as she stood surrounded by bodies. Her 4 remaining guards did their best to drive off the half a dozen assassins, but it was a losing fight, and even as she watched, one of the guards fell, his blood dyeing the gleaming blade of his killer. "Surrender yourself, and all of this will be a lot easier," one of the assassins said, as he wiped the blood from his sword. "We can stop all of this death if you just give yourself up." "Don't listen, Your Majesty," one of the guards said. "Support is on the way." Just then, the door opened, revealing 3 heavily armored royal guards. Cursing their ill luck, the assassins immediately tried to escape, but before they could, they were torn apart under the heavy blades wielded by the royal guard. The royal guard moved with ruthless efficiency, and after they had finished cutting down the assassins, they began to advance towards the princess. Just then, however, a figure flashed through the open door, calling for the princess to retreat. "Don't let them near you," Edward called out, his voice grim. Immediately, the 3 members of the royal guard burst into action, 2 of them turning around to face the old man, while one surged towards the princess. The 3 guards who were still alive threw themselves in the way, but the heavily armored royal guard was like an unstoppable boulder, smashing straight into the first guard. He threw him aside, even as his heavy blade hacked into the second, severing an arm and knocking the man to the side. The third guard lunged forward, wrapping himself around the royal guard only to bounce off as he was overpowered by the guard's strength. The two royal guards who had gone up against Edward, attacking from two different angles, found themselves in a much worse position. As the old man slipped past their attacks, landing heavy strikes that cracked their armor, he wielded a club, slamming it into the royal guards with enough force to shatter the thick plates of armor covering their bodies. Still, they bought enough time for the third guard to reach the princess's side. Through the eye holes in his helmet, the princess seemed to see a flare of crimson as the guard reached for her throat. Stumbling backwards, she screamed, and there was a muffled thump as a wave of power exploded from the crown, slamming into the royal guard with enough force to throw him across the room. As he crashed against the wall, the power continued to press down on him, crushing his armor and his body with it, until all that remained was a mangled pile of steel and flesh. The crown on the queen's head limped, drained of much of its strength. Edward finally managed to defeat one of the royal guards, causing the other to begin to back away. Before he could escape, however, Edward leapt over, bringing down his club with brutal force, crushing the man's head, helmet, and all. The stench of blood filled the room as the queen supported herself against the wall. His expression terrible, Edward looked at the three dead royal guards and shook his head. "The world has gone mad," he said, as he walked over to the queen. "We need to get you to a place of safety. It's not safe here." Taking a deep breath and trying to stabilize her emotions, the queen stood up. "Is there anywhere that's safe?" she asked. Her question caused Edward to grimace, and he hesitated for a moment, almost as if he was wondering whether he should lie or not. His lack of an answer was answer enough for the queen. All around the palace, the fighting was fierce. But nowhere was it fiercer than in the north wing, where Duke Arkoff stood in the middle of a trash drum, glaring in fury at the 10 figures that stood around him. 25 more lay dead or dying on the ground. But despite that, the assassins who remained showed no fear. "You're much stronger than reports have led us to believe," one of the assassins said. "But it doesn't matter. You'll still die here today." Without answering, Duke Arkoff just glared. The assassins had caught him off guard, trapping him in this room with some sort of strange, mysterious artifact that had warped the space. No matter which door he left from, he always ended up back in this same room. And every time, these 10 assassins were waiting for him to kill him. He had already slain them 3 different times, resulting in the bodies scattered around the room. Yet every time he left, they had returned to life, to throw themselves against him. As the Duke's fury grew, the entire space seemed to shake. Yet no matter how much power he mustered, he couldn't break free of the grip of the mysterious artifact. "My master is impressed with your strength," the lead assassin said. "So much so, that she is willing to offer you a tremendous opportunity. The opportunity to ascend beyond the mortal realm." The Duke's response was to stretch out his hand and manifest a giant sword made purely of his will. As the sword solidified, so did a dozen others hanging in the air around him, as his soul spark manifested itself into the world. With a roar, he slashed out, causing the swords to fly toward the assassins, who blocked in vain. Their bodies were torn apart in an instant, unable to withstand the tremendous power the Duke could wield. Yet even as they died, they laughed, mocking echoes bouncing throughout the room, and Duke Arkoff felt his heart sink, as the certainty that no matter how he left the room, he would end up right back here, facing them once again, settled into his heart. Tope continued.